What will you do with your fleeting moment? My grandmother always used to say that you could judge the value of a person based on two things: the amount of time that they showed up in service for others and the manner in which they treated the people that they didn't need. You see, my grandmother was a very religious woman. She went to church often. She used to say prayers with my sisters and I every night before we'd go to bed. I grew up in a struggling household in a poor area of Central Florida. My dad was a truck driver, and even though he wasn't linked to me by blood, he worked unspeakably hard to make a life that was better for me and for my family. My mother was disabled, as was my grandmother for the majority of my upbringing, but they were two strong Italian women that attempted to instill in their children an idea of gratitude in the things that we achieved, ideas of confidence in going after our dreams and trying to fly higher than maybe even they thought was possible. They also pushed me to get an education. They told me that my education was my ticket to success, and so I did. I was the first person in my family to graduate high school, the first to go to college, graduate school. I traveled abundantly, and overall, I attempted to do what I think they wanted me to do, which is live abundantly, live more abundantly than they had the opportunity to do. My grandmother died in 2008 of cancer while I was still a student here at Florida State, and I remember feeling devastated, deflated, because I realized that all the time I thought I had to pay her back for everything that she had given me was actually a lot more, was actually gone. I would never be able to pay her back for her sacrifice. And I remember thinking that it was because of the things that she instilled in me and the values that she wanted me to uphold that I really found a passion professionally, academically, in public service, international development, the development of communities, being a voice for those who need one. It was something that I decided that I wanted to devote my life to. I also learned, as so many of us often do when we lose a loved one, that each of our lives, especially the opportunities that we have in our lives to leave a lasting impact, are just fleeting moments of time. Sparks in the universe that ebb and flow and sometimes are gone before we have the ability to say goodbye. And so I started to think, obviously, being so grateful for the values that were instilled in me by my parents, my grandmother, whether or not those things that I was so passionate about were really the root of what they had been instilled in me, or if it was rooted in something deeper than that. I should say, based on what I've just said, I'm not a bleeding heart. I'm not even an optimist. I'm a realist. I'm an economist. And I believe in burdens of proof. And it's because I believe all of those things that I actually believe that altruism, or in this case, defined as loving others as you love yourself, or being principally concerned with the improvement of others' lives, or the improvement of their welfare, is as much indigenously a part of who we are as humans as turning oxygen into carbon dioxide. From an economic perspective, from a psychological perspective, from a biological perspective, really altruism is what defines, I believe, defines who we are as humans and where we've come from. And so to explore a little bit why I believe this, obviously I said I'm an economist, right? I believe in the facts. I want to explore three specific rules of thumb, really, or pieces of wisdom that for many of us have likely defined how we believe we essentially got here in the first place in terms of the human race, how we believe that we make decisions in the world, and also how we believe that we essentially derive value from the world around us. We'll look at three pieces of information to look at essentially if those ideas hold weight. And so the first idea that I want to look at is the idea of survival of the fittest, right? And so in literature, in evolutionary literature, survival of the fittest, or evolution, it's so often cited that competition is the reason why species or organisms have survived, right? It's the reason why they were able to pass on their genetic legacy. But more and more, as scientists are looking into whether that claim is true, they find that actually cooperation, in many instances, is just as important, if not more important, in defining how exactly different organisms were able to pass on their genetic legacy. And if you think about it from a cellular level, it makes sense, right? Cooperating simple cells cooperated in terms of sharing energy and helping to create energy-creating processes that created complex cells, Complex cells did the same thing to create organisms, and then you oftentimes see organisms that create mega-organisms in forms of ant colonies and beehives. Large cities, for instance, the same principle. You can also see examples of altruism or cooperation in the animal kingdom in a variety of ways. Everything from when you see monkeys and fruit bats who are essentially sharing food with one another, even folks who are outside of their kin because they want the survival of their like kind to survive. Everything from that, from crows and squirrels who are alert folks when there's danger around, even if it puts their lives at risk. And even bees, ants, other sorts of species that will raise the offspring of other ants and bees, foregoing the opportunity for them themselves to prolong or extend their genetic legacy. And so what about humans? Obviously, it's very difficult to analyze whether a human is acting altruistically based on something that is genetically encoded in them, or if it's actually a symptom of something that they learned, right? A learned behavior. So it's actually a very interesting set of studies that have essentially looked at how exactly babies or toddlers, some as young as 15, 18 months, how they respond when they are put in a situation where they view someone who is struggling to complete a particular task or who has run into some sort of challenge, right? These are controlled experiments where they essentially break up toddlers into different groups. Those toddlers are put in a situation where somebody is either has dropped a piece of cloth, has dropped a clothespin, is trying to complete some sort of task, and they observe the baby. They observe the toddler to see basically what they're going to do. And two things happen overwhelmingly. One, babies almost instinctually always try to help. They spring into action, almost as if they are little superheroes or something like that. They always want to help in a variety of different tasks and a variety of different challenges. The second thing that happens is that there's a body of research that looks at pupil dilation. When people's pupils dilate, it actually is associated with concern, with empathy. And they looked at the toddlers, and again, they found that not only did each of the toddlers who experienced or were put in a situation have their pupils dilating, but also the treatment group that was put in a situation where they viewed somebody struggling but were not able to do anything, those are the ones that experienced it the most, implying that we as humans, potentially before we learned any sort of behaviors or socialized really in any sort of way, have something embedded deeper in us. The second argument, or essentially piece of knowledge that I want to look at, has to do with people are self-rational and interested. Again, from an economic standpoint, all of you have probably heard this, Econ 101. Adam Smith said that people acting in self-interested, rational ways is the invisible hand of the economy, right? It's not that a baker bakes bread because he's concerned about whether he can feed people. It's because he wants to sell the bread because he wants money and he wants to buy the things that he wants, right? That's the basis of a market economy. But is human rationality and how we make decisions so simple? Do we act rationally? Are we motivated by financial incentives or not? And there's a body of research, again, that shows that actually it's not that simple. Financial incentives, as it turns out, doesn't really do a good job of motivating people. There's two ways that scientists, economists have looked at this question. One, they've tried to see if there's an association with higher salaries and personal satisfaction, right? If you're paid more, obviously you would enjoy your job more. You would feel like maybe you're getting some sort of purpose out of it. And they find that actually there is little to no relationship at all. Just because you're paid more doesn't mean that you feel like you're being, that you actually like what you're doing. The second way that people look at it is through a series of, again, controlled experiments. What they look at is essentially if you all were given a task to do, and you were told that if you did relatively well, you would get a small bit of money. If you did relatively well, you would get a little bit more, maybe a medium sum of money. And if you did really well, you would get a very large sum of money, right? And based on economic principles, rationality, you would expect people to perform better, right? And again, this is a study that's been looked at, it's been replicated across different constituencies, even in the developing world, where the sum of money was actually pretty significant as compared to monthly income, yearly income, right? If you were playing this game and 2 months' salary was on the line, this could be a big deal for you, right? And in every single one of those cases, they found actually that in the presence of money, in the presence of financial incentives, people do worse in the presence of those incentives. Again, implying that maybe they don't actually derive that much value from finances, from financial incentives. And so the second thing that we want to kind of unpack that a little bit more is people make irrational decisions all the time, right? Rational decision in this case means that you hold your benefit as the highest concern in the decisions that you make, right? That's a rational decision. And there's something that behavioral economists use called the public goods game. Public goods game goes something like this. If I gave everybody in this room $10, right? $10, just the goodness of my heart. And then I said, each of you could put this money into a pot of money, right? And everybody who participated, I'm going to double the amount that's in the pot, and I'm going to equally allocate it back to everybody who participated, right? From a rational standpoint, what you would probably do in that situation is contribute nothing and hope that everybody contributes their money so that you get to keep yours and you walk away with the most amount. Or you would maybe give like a penny or something like that. Maybe you're a little bit altruistic, you feel a little bit bad about it. But obviously the cooperative, more altruistic way would be if you contributed the whole thing so that everybody who participated walked away with the most benefit, right? And again, these studies looked at this. That they found is that time and time and again, when people are given the opportunity to make this decision, they instinctually always try to choose the decision or make the decision that benefits the entire group. And again, if it's so simple why people are rational and self-interested, why then do we see these tendencies in studies and in human behavior? And so the third thing that I want to talk about relates to a common phrase that I'm sure you all have heard of before, right? Hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard, right? It's an old adage. And whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it, I think what it implies essentially is that hard work and talent are maybe the two most important principles of success, right? That if you work hard and you want it hard enough, you can get ahead. If you're very talented, maybe you need to work a little bit hard, but things are going to come easier to you. But the question I pose is, what if actually the institutions and the governance that you found yourself operating within had more to do with your success than your hard work and your talent, right? Maybe not as much, but actually were a common factor that defined how successful you're going to be. That question is not a loaded one. It actually can be measured, again, in various ways. First example that I want to talk about, and it's actually probably very timely for the discussions that have been happening today, but it's privilege, specifically white privilege. And I know what you're all thinking, straight white male on stage trying to talk about white privilege. I think if we just hold each other's hands and buckle down, we're going to get through this, I promise. Everybody believe me, okay? But the reality is, people don't, and the reason why I make a joke is because it is sometimes uncomfortable for people to talk about race, and I understand that. Mostly because people don't like to believe that their success had anything to do with other than their hard work, right? I'm the one, I faced challenges, I'm the one who did the work, I'm the one who gets to reap the benefit. Either that, or maybe they've never experienced privilege or being on the opposite end of privilege, or maybe it's just that they just don't care, that they like the fact that they get to benefit from these systems. But there's a very interesting set of data, research again, that kind of starts to quantify in some ways how privilege can basically set certain people up for failure and certain people up for success. And there's a very interesting study that was done at the University of Chicago by a set of economists that essentially took two resumes, right? Identical resumes, you may have all heard of this, where they essentially put all the identical information on each, and they sent them out to hundreds of employers around the country. And the only difference was that on one of the resumes, they had traditionally white-sounding names, right? And on the others, they put traditionally black-sounding names. I'll spare you some of the details, but overall, the conclusion of that study was that for white-sounding names, they were 50% more likely to get a call back than their black counterparts. Now again, I know some of you, maybe the skeptics in the room will say, well, the callback wasn't everything. You'd have to go, you'd have to, interview for this, and you'd have to, basically show your stuff to get the job, but that's not the point. The point is that really, to even get your foot in the door, right? The amount of talent and hard work had nothing to do with whether people had this opportunity or not. And again, these people are fictitious, but this happens in the real world every day. And it's potentially one of the reasons why in the labor market, African Americans do poorly compared to their white counterparts. Maybe it's the reason why racial inequality is such a huge issue in this country. And so obviously privilege is an institution that you all, a lot of us, have no control over, that set people up, certain people up for failure, some people up for success. And there's other institutions, other examples of this. Another example is something that people have looked at before that has looked at essentially how rules and institutions, again, set people up whether they know it or not, give them inherent advantages. And so basically, the short version is, economists have looked at why exactly in certain professional sports that there is a bunching of athletes that were born within weeks of each other, right? Why exactly is that? And what people found was the reason for that is because of the arbitrary dates that were put in place that defined when you could start playing that sport when you were a youth, right? At a very young age. And there are certain sports that do this, right? There's international soccer, there's baseball, there's hockey in Canada where you start in the pee-wee level, you get to the junior level, and you work your way up to be a pro one day, right? And essentially what they found was, and the gist of it, let's take it to its logical conclusion. If the cutoff date was January 1st, that means that for a small boy who wanted to play hockey in Canada, who was born January 2nd, he's playing hockey alongside individuals who were born potentially the end of December, right? That's essentially 1 year difference, right, in their birth dates. That difference might not be a big deal when you're in college, but it's a big deal when you're 10 years old, right? You're physically more superior potentially, you're stronger, you're faster, you're more developed cognitively, maybe you make better decisions. And overall, you can essentially get fast-tracked, right? Maybe you get put on an all-star team. That all-star team has better teammates, access to better coaches. Those coaches, you have access to those teammates when you have more practices. Those more practices lead to more games. And as a result, what started as just an arbitrary timeline when people could start playing sports ended up being something where individuals who, by no fault of their own really, were given an advantage that they didn't deserve and that they, quite frankly, didn't ask for. But regardless of that, they were put on a fast track. And you see this not just in professional sports, right? That's just a phenomenon that's very interesting, but you see it in education too. Education is another example where, depending on when you start, economists have looked at international tests that look at math and science, and they'll see that fourth graders who are born in earlier parts of the year versus latter parts of the year, on average, will outperform their peers by 12 to 15 percentage points. That is oftentimes the difference between whether or not an individual is accepted to a gifted program or isn't. And so here, it doesn't mean that hard work and talent don't mean anything. It means, though, that regardless of whether you have hard work or talent, the institutions that you operate within, the advantages that you are given, regardless of whether you know them, are sometimes more important. And so ultimately, I hope that you don't think that I've taken you through a wild goose chase of behavioral science and biology and all of these other disciplines, because essentially this is what I'm trying to say. Altruism is not something that is a virtue, right? It's not something that people do when they're good people. It is very much you paying homage to your genetic legacy. You are literally the ancestor of generation upon generation of organism whose only ability to be here, whose only ability to pass down their genetic legacy was their ability to cooperate and practice altruism. The second thing, altruism is how we derive true value, right? When we say that people are rational and self-interested, again, that doesn't tell the whole story. People actually have altruistic tendencies. So what I argue here is not that people give up. To act altruistically, people give up value, right? It's that people derive value from altruism altogether. And ultimately, what I'm trying to say as well is that altruism, in the context of the institutions that govern our lives and the inherent advantages that some of us enjoy and some of us don't, acting altruistically, being concerned about other people's welfare, their benefit, it's justice. And so I ask again, what will you do with your fleeting moment? Thank you.